I feel sad and I feel a bit of pain when I think about Glenn Gould. Why do I feel like that? Well, Glenn Gould was the greatest pop star of all the classical performers of the 20th century. His performances remain, to most people who encounter them, addictive, fascinating, intense, a kind of application of cold white heat to the score as it's realized in sound, or not realized in sound, as I'm going to argue. But that's the public perception. I don't think that's knowledge. I think that's an expression of the shallow relationship with classical music that nearly everyone who engages with classical music has. I mean, I think that most people are skeptical of Glenn Gould's Mozart and Beethoven. But it's also true to say that most people who have a professional relationship with classical music highly regard Gould's Bach. I also highly regard Gould's Bach, but I regard his Bach as a great pop achievement, which I compare not to Alfred Brendel or Edwin Fischer, but to Lady Gaga. And one of the things that I'm going to do, not in this video, but in another one soon, is via examples illustrate how Glenn Gould deformed and misrepresented masterpieces in a way that was an expression of pop genius. It left them addictive. It left them continuous with the kind of physical experience you might have in a nightclub, actually. And that point can't really be made without examples. So maybe I'll circle back to it and now say a bit about what then the source of the pain is if I think Glenn Gould's a great pop star. Because of course, there is another great pop star in the 20th century who isn't a performer but is a composer, Rachmaninoff. And I feel no pain about Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff for me is clean. He's not a serious composer, but he is a pop genius. As commercial products go, his Paganini variations are better than the best product Apple ever made. They tap into everything that there is to tap into in a listener's mind without giving a listener a transportation experience and without deeply moving the listener, but giving the listener the impression that they've been deeply moved. Gould does the same. Gould gives people the impression that they've been moved, but often they haven't. They've just been left fascinated and intrigued, and they've been woken up to something that is incredibly alluring and even physically arresting. But let's circle out of that and look at what the source of the pain is for me. And the pain is that there's nobody in the history of recorded sound, the history of classical music in recorded sound, who had this vast quantity of talent and mishandled it that badly. One virtue that Gould had was a facility for metronomic playing. You might think, what the hell is this? What kind of a point is it? I mean, there is a metronome. Anybody can play metronomically? No. In the history of piano playing, there have only been two people who could really play well metronomically. One is a great pianist, Alfred Cortot, and the other is Glenn Gould. Both could do it on a very, very high level. Now, there are three kinds of tempo. One's metronomic tempo, one's improvisatory tempo, and one is psychological tempo. Psychological tempo is the tempo in which almost all piano music proceeds. Psychological tempo is, unlike improvisatory tempo, conductable. But it's not metronomic. It's completely tight and right, but it's tight and right not according to the metronome, but according to the initiated listener's experience of the connection between one note and another. Now, that kind of strength for psychological rhythm, which Alfred Brendel and Wilhelm Kempf and Edwin Fischer and Alfred Cortot had on the highest level, Gould didn't have at all. But metronomical rhythmical precision, Gould had on the highest level. And most professional pianists can't do it. Gun to their head. Pop star pianists like Horowitz, serious pianists like Schnabel couldn't match Gould's metronomical precision if they'd been forced into giving it their best. Another quality that Gould had on the highest level was a facility for executing his concept. I don't think there has ever been a musician in the history of recorded sound who has been as secure in the execution of his concept as Gould. Almost in a sort of frightening way, as though there is a sort of simultaneity of task fulfillment going on that is superhuman. And of course, a corollary of that is that Glenn Gould was fantastic at leading completely independent voices. But these voices were led in metronomic tempo. One of the consequences of that, combined with the sound production that Gould aimed at, was a kind of artificial synthesizer sound and a kind of artificial synthesizer aura. Because not just sonically, but also rhythmically, Gould took you in a direction that went away from the piano and towards something electronic. Likewise, Gould's intellect was brilliant, but he had two problems. He was self-taught, and he couldn't teach himself well enough. And even his greatest admirer, Edward Said, called Gould the village philosopher, the philosopher who philosophizes, but with a set of references that are only available to a villager who hasn't seen what's going on in the other villages. And so I think that's a sense of how I feel about Gould. It's a bit painful. But the picture is always more complex. And the reason that the picture is always more complex is because you can't hear what you want to hear. You have to hear what's really there. And Gould was, in fact, one of the greatest players of 20th century piano music. Gould wasn't a pop star when he played the Berg piano sonata. You can find several versions of it online. I think one's a video version, maybe even two are. And that's a reading that's not as good as, it's better than anybody else's reading. So when I say that Glenn Gould was a pop star, I don't say that that's all he was. I say that that's the main thing he was. But there are some recordings of his that are in fact the best recordings in history of the pieces at hand. But that just doesn't apply to Mozart or Beethoven. And more controversially, I say it doesn't apply to Bach. But this was a taster. And next time we're getting much more deeply into what it means to be a classical pop star via the means and the maneuvers that Gould practiced. And we're going to use some examples about how Gould could take a Beethoven sonata and make it a completely addictive, almost electrifyingly addictive pop product.